All right, we're looking at ZinZin's image here. You're at ISO 800, which there's not really any need for that high of an ISO here when you're outside and it's overcast, but but there's enough light and it's you, so you can sit still. So I would probably bring that down a little bit. You're at 33 millimeters, which works really well when you're doing architecture. It gives more depth to the image. So it allows us to feel like there's more distance between the front of the image in where you are and where you are to the back of the image. So 33 millimeters was smart. F5.6 gives us enough depth of field in this. And then, like I said, you could have a little bit of a longer shutter speed. Just 1/50th of a second would still allow you to be nice and still, but would allow you to bring down that ISO a little bit. The exposure on you, the light on you looks good. The way that you're using this architecture to bring us to you is working well. So like I said, we have this line, we have these lines coming across, even like the line of the tree is sort of pointing to you. So you're using the architecture in a smart way. And then even the organic shapes within the architecture. So the grass is very regimented as it's stuck in this little the slice within the cement, and then even this plant and the trees, even though they're a little overgrown, is very regimented. So your organic shape works well here. I would watch the edges a little bit. So this here seems like a distraction. It's not adding to the image. Even this, as it's like unkept, it's all pointing towards you, which is looking good. But because there's no water in there, it doesn't add to the formality of the image, which we're enjoying. As we get closer, we can see the focus is off. It looks like it's behind you and not on you. You're not totally sharp, but what's behind you is. So as you're setting something up like this, either having, I think you said you had a friend snap this, but having your friend sit in your place and mark where you are, or setting your focal points so that you know exactly where you are in the frame, and making sure that you are setting your focal point if you're using autofocus would work well here. And then the last thing I would say is that this is a really dynamic image as far as the way the lines are moving us through the frame. So changing your angle of view so you're not totally centered would probably work better here. Having yourself more on a third line instead of, well, you kind of are on a third line, but pushing yourself even a little bit further towards the third line and avoiding this part of the frame, I think would work better. Oh, and then here we have your setup of the different areas. This looks like a really nice image as well, using the stairs behind you. All right, this image is by Bridgette. You're at ISO 20,000, so a really high ISO. 27 millimeters f4 at 1/60th of a second. So there's a lot of things that are working in this image and areas for improvement. And that ISO 20,000 is an area of improvement. I know you said you like the grittiness, I think you said, of the grain. And I want to be really clear on the difference between grain and digital noise. So film grain is what people are attracted to, and that has a nice texture to it, and it has rounded edges to it. And when we're looking at film imagery that has a lot of grain, we're seeing the actual silver highlights in the image, and those are coming out, and we're seeing these organic shapes. And that's different than what you're seeing when you have a high ISO. If we look at this closer and we look at this, it's kind of messy mix of different colors are being added. We can't see the texture of your skin. It's just this messiness that's being added. So if you like the look of film grain, which is fair, like a ton of people are into that. People will shoot film and then push their film to get more grain in it. Like there's an appeal to that. But we want to add that after the fact. You don't want to substitute digital noise for film grain. You want to photograph with a low ISO and then add a layer of film grain to that in post-processing. All right, that being said, the exposure that you have on yourself is great here. So assuming that there was no digital noise, the amount of light hitting the image sensor looks good here. And the way you have the light coming in and just showing the side of your face as it like comes across here, comes across, it creates a sense of mystery about you. And I think that's exactly what you wanted to portray, that at home, you said everyone in Birmingham knows each other. You're all went to high school together or whatever, right? So when you're out of town, you have this kind of alter ego that comes out that's able to be a little bit more free. And that's what you're showing us here. So by having that light just come across part of your face and keeping part of you in mystery, I think works really well to expose this kind of alter ego, if you will. And then you're sitting with confidence on these steps. One thing I do find distracting is that light underneath you. That's not showing us like a busy city street. It's just showing us some light underneath you. And our eye is always going to go to the brightest area of the image. And that being below you takes us away from just looking at you. Right? And you wouldn't want to crop your feet out of this. Your feet are really important. But if we crop that out, we can see our attention goes right to your face. And then when that is in there, my eye just goes back and forth between you and what's down below there. So I would photograph this in a way that didn't have such bright light here. If that's a different, like right before the lights all go on, right? More towards the dusk instead of into the night. That might work better so that our attention really stays on you. Because I think this image, what you're using, how you're using the structure of the stairs and the roughness of the stairs and showing the side of your personality and the light on you is all working really well. But then there's a distracting element with the digital noise and that light below you. All right, here we're looking at Elodia's image, and let's look at your settings here. You're at ISO 6400, so really high ISO. And you're at 18 millimeters, f22 at 1/40th of a second. So by having the f22, you're having to raise your ISO really high. And there's a benefit of f22 because it's going to give you more depth of field in your image, which can be kind of forgiving if you're shooting a self-portrait, right? If you have more depth of field, then the lack of focus might be easier to overcome. But having a really high ISO is going to show us that digital noise that we're trying to avoid. So if we look closer at some shadowed areas like in here or under your chin here, we can see that digital noise that we're trying to avoid. So I'd pull back on that. The light on you is coming from behind you, and it's really lighting up your hand. If we put this in the develop module, we can see that it's really blown out behind you, which is fine, but it's also blown out on your hand. So I would pull back on that light. We don't want the brightest area to be on your hand because just like we talked about with Bridgette's image, we were looking below her instead of at her. And this forces me to keep going back to your hand instead of focusing on your face. And then your point of focus, I think, is a bit in front of you. It seems like even the top of the marigolds here, which is really cool that you made this, are more in focus than your eyes are. So I think your point of focus is just a little bit in front of you. And I forget if you explained how you photographed this, if you had a stand-in or what you did. But I know you mentioned that you wanted soft focus in this. And I would encourage you, if you want soft focus, not simply to have your image slightly out of focus, because that's always going to look like a mistake. That's never going to look like it's intentional, but rather to approach it in a different way. And I gave you some ideas of different ways that you can do that, like photographing through a stocking or photographing with Vaseline on your lens. Or if you have an older camera, I wouldn't do this with your good camera, but something that's really fun is taking the lens off of your camera and then still photographing through the lens, but having it slightly off. That can create this really fun, blurry look that works really well and looks intentional, where here it just looks like you missed your point of focus. The expression here is you're kind of leaning forward and looking at us. I think that's interesting. Getting close, eliminating anything that would be distracting is working well. And then just the question, like, what's going on in this image? What are you showing us? What's the story behind this? Create some interest for me. This image is by Maelle, and we haven't seen many images from you, so it's great to see this, but there are some corrections that would need to be made for your image. And the first is that this was shot in an auto mode, and actually it's not showing there. But if we open this up in Bridge, you can see that it was shot in auto mode. So all images need to be shot in manual mode in order to get credit for them. So you'll need to reshoot this in a manual mode. And then also you can see that the flash fired, so that needs to be turned off. If you look at other images, it can say did not fire, but yours says fired. And we see that when we look at the image. So we see that harshness and flattening that happens with a flash. So for one, we see that the brighter area is the area that's closer to the lens. So your legs are brighter and have more light on them than your face does. And this is because the light on the on-camera flash doesn't have a lot of range to it. So it can't reach as far. So your face is not going to get that illumination. Your shirt's not going to get that illumination that your pants do. And then also, when you're using a flash, it flattens out the image. So the depth that we want to see, the detail that we want to see, all gets flattened out. So those are different reasons why you would want to avoid using a flash. The image of you sitting on the couch with your friend, there's just so much joy in your image for both of you. And you can tell this is like a get together. And like you said, you haven't been able to see each other. You haven't been able to be at a gathering in a long time. So that joy between you, that friendship between you, kind of the cuddling of the two makes, like warms my heart to see, really. So I think you're communicating quite a bit with this image, but we need to make some technical corrections. And that's the same here with Joe's image. You're at ISO 16, 2.87 millimeters, f2.2 at 1/900th of a second. So all of those settings look off. And then as we move down, we can see this was shot with your iPhone. And if you had a reason to shoot this with your iPhone, and you discussed it with me beforehand, you'd have to have a really good reason. It might be something that's acceptable. I'm not completely against the idea of using iPhone. We have a whole shot on mobile class that students are taking. So there's a place for it, but it has to work into the concept of the image. And I don't see how that's working in the concept of your image here. The really wide angle lens that you have at 2.87 millimeters really expands the space, right? So the distance between you and the basketball hoop looks further. You're as tall as the basketball hoop. You're much taller than the fences behind you. So that kind of optical illusion of the really wide angle lens is always interesting to me. And then it looks like the phone is on the ground and shooting up. So your eye contact as we're a little bit lower. Feels like you're going to like just run past us with this ball that we feel like we're in a game that we can't win, right? You look like the stronger athlete because of our point of view. So I think that point of view works really well here.